welcome to Receipt City. I'm Roz, and today I want to cover a story which I called Frankie Lymon, The Lonely Architecture. And the reason I call him that is because he was a pioneer at the time. He paved the way for rock and roll, R&B, doo-wop groups. He was 13 at the time, and he lived a really tragic type of life in the sense that he was met with a lot of hardships, but he achieved so much at a young age. And I was reading one of his articles that he did for Ebony Magazine. And this was like, he was at this time considered like peaked out his career. Now he was only like 24, but by this time people consider him a has-been. And a lot of that was due to his addiction, which he had to drugs, which was heroin at the time. Y'all might have seen the movie Why Do Fools Fall in Love with Lorenz Tate and Vivica Fox and Halle Berry and Lela Rochon. And that basically talked about his personal life, but I want to get more into his own life and what was he feeling up to the time he passed away, which was interesting. And by reading this interview, it gave me more in-depth insight as to who he was as a person. He was very charming. He had that all go around personality and character that people gravitate to. And you have to remember, this was back during before even the civil rights era, like right when civil rights era was beginning to start, and he was breaking through, traveling to Europe with the group the teenagers. They were all minorities, Puerto Rican descent, African American, and they were a hit. This was something real big back then, so I really want to give him his props. He eventually got his recognition with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he also got a Hollywood star with the teenagers. However, he wasn't here to enjoy those rewards. He suffered through most of the times that he should have been given his rewards while he was on Earth. So I'm going to go ahead and delve into his story and get a sense of where he was at that time in his life. And thank you for joining me today. So at 13, singer Frankie Lymon and the doo-wopping teenagers had a #1 R&B hit in the US and a #1 pop hit in England with Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Also later on, Diana Ross did a remake back in the 80s. I still think the original was a wonderful version. And I want to get into this article because at this point, it tells you the lifestyle he was living, the lifestyle of what he was experiencing. I could say right off the bat, by reading this article, I could tell that he had inexperience. He had street smarts. He had street hustle. He grew up in Harlem in New York City. However, the business and the business sharks, they took advantage of his youth, his vitality, and his talent. And all of that was taken from him. And he died at 25 from a heroin overdose. So let's get into this last article he did with Ebony. This came out back in January of 1967. And I'm going to read a few of the pieces of the article so you could get where he was coming from. The height of agony arrived in February 1966 when Frankie was arrested on charges of stealing a set of drums from a recording studio and pawning them to finance his habit. He insists to this day that it was a bum rap, that was accused because it was generally known he needed money and knew the location of the drums. Despite his denials, Frankie was arraigned on burglary charge. and as of his writing, still faced trial. Confident that he will ultimately be vindicated, he is not as much concerned about his arrest as he is about the possible damage that publicity about the case would do to his attempted comeback. So during this time, he was trying to do a comeback. He had charges, like you hear with a lot of current artists to this day, that some charges, and but he was trying to make a comeback, and back then that was looked negative, as a negative flaw. I will say, when this article was done, they ended up having him go to the army. So back then, a lot of times, because it was Vietnam going on, there was a draft, they needed more bodies to go over there and fight the war. If you committed a crime, you had the option of jail time or serving in the war. And I knew of a couple of people who did that. And Frankie Lymon ended up doing that. He decided to join the army. So I'm going to go into the next paragraph, but this is what happened. This was, of course. Undoubtedly, women were nearly as much to blame for the moral and physical dissipation of a young Frankie Lymon as was narcotics. So I want to briefly say he grew up in a two-parent family. Both of his parents were service workers. His mom was a maid. His dad, I think, worked as I think they said like a shopkeeper or something like that. They had talents. They used to sing as well. It was Frankie, and I believe there was either 3 or 4 other brothers. And he, at 13, no, actually at 12, they said, or was it 10? I believe it was 10. He got a job to help his family make the ends meet. So he's always was this, he grew up, he was ahead of his time. Like, he was growing up really faster than what he should have been growing up. But back then, as it is now, the product of survival. And I'm going to, this is the part where he's famous, and this is what's happening. Undoubtedly, women were nearly as much to blame for the moral and physical dissipation of the young Frankie Lymon as was narcotics. Now, I know I sound like I repeat myself, excuse me, but I wanted you to get clear on this. Because this part is what, when people read this article, was just like mouth drop, and was like, wow. Indeed, it was a woman more than twice his age who introduced the impressionable youngster to heroin when he was only 15. Even at 15, however, the handsome teenager was no stranger to drugs or women. He mused, I never was a child, although I was billed in every theater and auditorium where I appeared as a child star. I was a man when I was 11 years old, doing everything that most men do. In the neighborhood where I live, there was no time to be a child. There were 5 children in my family, and my folks had to scuffle to make ends meet. My father was a truck driver, and my mother worked as a domestic in white folks' homes. While most kids my age were playing stickball and marbles, I was working at the corner store, carrying orders to help pay the rent. I know all about women as long as I can remember. When I was 10, I made a good living hustling prostitutes for the white man who would come up to Harlem looking for Negro girls. I knew every prostitute in our neighborhood, and I'd get a commission for every customer I brought them. I was a fresh young kid, and some of them thought I was cute. Sometimes they paid me off with something extra. I learned everything there was to know about women before I was 12 years old. Wow. So basically he's saying he probably even lost his virginity, and in that case to an older woman. So it wasn't really an innocent thing. That was more like a molestation. If this are grown women doing this to a young kid, The wistful little boy's smile still crinkles the corner of his mouth when he's amused, and the missing tooth gives him an impish kind of charm when he laughs, but the eyes are jaded and wise beyond their years. The kids in my neighborhood grew up fast, he recalls. smoking pot, marijuana, was so commonplace that the kids 11 and 12 years old puffed reefer in the street corners. I had been smoking marijuana when I was in grade school, but I didn't start using the real stuff, heroin, until I got into show business. Wow. So imagine that. He is telling you right there his life basically. And you always hear, you hear about the kids that this is just mind blowing. So I'm going to continue on reading. At the height of his popularity, he was about 14 years old and earning as much as $5,000 per week for personal appearances. The first recording cut by Frankie and his vocal group, The Teenagers, was entitled Why Do Fools Fall in Love? It grossed about $500,000 in sales. That's a lot of money back then. That was a lot of money. He was Michael Jackson before Michael Jackson became Michael Jackson as a kid. You know what I'm saying? Our records was making bells of money, and every major theater and auditorium in the U.S. and Europe was bidding for us. We were still considered children and capable of handling our own earnings, Frankie recalled. As a result, 3 lawyers were hired to handle our money for us, and we were given about $40 apiece each week for spending change. The rest went into a trust fund, which we were to receive when we reached manhood. I wonder, did he ever get that money? For Frankie, a 14-year-old with adult lust, the shortage of cash was, in his words, the real drag. I met all kind of chicks, but I could never ball them the way I wanted to because I didn't have any money. You have to have some kind of money, if only to buy drinks. Of course, you could get away with buying ice cream and sodas for the Bobby Soxers. That's the young girls back then. But I never liked the screaming teenage type. They didn't know anything about life. I went for women 25 or over. They were less trouble and more rewarding. Frankie confessed that he passed most of his sweethearts off as his mother or older sister to avoid possible scandal. So like the lead singer from that group, The Platters, Zola Taylor, which they showed in that movie, she was way older than him. But he utilized that essence of his youth and that as a publicity stunt to say, that was my auntie. But in actuality, this is a woman that he was probably intimate with. The amorous youngster's first big show business romance was with a nightclub dancer who later accompanied him on his tours while posing with him as his mother. I first met her at a party given in honor of my group when we were playing in LA. This gorgeous doll walked up, pinched my cheek, and said, "Oh, isn't he cute?" I told her, "You're not so bad yourself, baby. You sure look good to me." I guess she was pretty shocked. I wanted to laugh right there when he said that. I was holding it in. She said, "You shouldn't talk to your elders like that." I asked her, "How about us going to breakfast after your last show?" Later, I bought a couple of fits of scotch and took her to my room. What? And he was like, how old? This was like Lil Wayne doing Lil Wayne. This was doing Lil Wayne stuff. Oh my God. Okay. A lot of things have not changed as I see. It didn't take long for the child star lovemaking prowess to make the rounds. In show business, Frankie declares, gossip travel fast. Pretty soon, I had a whole stable of women, one in every city. Of course, having them pose as my mother had its disadvantages. I couldn't be seen drinking with them. And once my little game was nearly exposed when the newspaper reporter who had been introduced to one of my mothers in New York caught my act in Chicago and was introduced to another one of my mothers. I had a hard time convincing him that he had seen the same woman in both cities, especially since they looked nothing alike. Frankie, the boy who never was a child, was snatched from the obscurity of his Harlem slum neighborhood at the age of 13 and catapulted to national prominence by a one-in-a-million quirk of fate. That kind of coincidence was just the grist of cheap novels. There were 5 of us, and we used to harmonize every night on the street corner until the neighbors would call the cops to run us away, he recalls. One night, an older guy named Richard Barrett, who sang with an established group called the Valentines, heard us rehearsing an original tune right away, and I got the idea of putting the music to the essay I had written, Frankie revealed. It took me about 2 hours to work up the song. The tune waxed less than a week after the audition and distributed under the label G Records. A previously unknown record company racked a fantastic 2.5 million sales in less than a year and established Frankie Lymon and his teenagers as the nation's leading singing group. So these kids were big time. They were big time. They were like New Kids on the Block, One Direction. They were like the Jackson 5 of their era. Dazzled by newspaper and television fanfare, their heads spinning with Disney dreams, new and more fabulous worlds to conquer. By 5 new overnight sensations embarked on an extensive tour, a 6-month odyssey, which was to take them to theaters and concert halls in 50 major U.S. cities and to London, Scotland, Dublin, Paris, Sydney, Australia. Wow. Accompanying them was Morris Levy, former president of G Records, who was so impressed by the group's potential that he had resigned to devote his energy to managing Frankie and the teenagers. Now, I think this became like the wrong move. Almost from the very beginning, there was bickering and dissension. Sometimes it's good to just keep it as it is rather than trying to add something new to the mix. In this sense, adding new management to the mix, or manager period, caused the breakup of the group. Seriously. When the group originally had been organized, the 5 boys had called themselves the Teenagers, and there had been no lead singer. Here we go with this method. Every time you look around, SWV was supposed to be SWV. Then became Coco singing all the leads. Same thing with 702. 702 was supposed to be all 4 and then all 3 singers. Then it ended up being, I forgot her name. Can't think of her name. Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. But the brown skinned girl, ended up being the lead singer for most of the songs for the duration of their career. Dissension broke up. You know the story. Same thing they did to Jackson 5. Michael had the key talent because of his package being small and this big voice. However, his other brothers were talented too, including Tito, okay? But what did they do? They put Michael out there. They started putting Michael to the side. They started doing this and that. And this is what they've been doing. This is the formula. This is how groups break up. Because they always pick 1 or 2, and it's usually just the one out the group, and tell them they're extra special, or they have the potential to do things bigger and better than the rest, or the rest are dragging them down. It's just frustrating because most groups are successful because they are a group. Most. You may have 1% that can branch off. Lionel Richie from the Commodores did his thing. Beyonce from Destiny Child, she did her thing. But how many other groups think they could do the same thing and not think that there's backlash from that? And there's groups that tried it. If you watch TV One's Unsung and you watch a lot of those groups, they're old school groups. However, you always see the same type of formula. Management, mismanagement of money, contracts. One person out of the group is getting more attention than the others. And then here come the other issues, drugs and alcohol. These are the formulas for a group, whether you R&B, pop, jazz, any kind of, doesn't matter. But if you're in the entertainment industry, this is what you're bound to get if you're not strong-minded, know your values, and know what you know, and have good people around you, not yes men. Sorry for my rant, but this is just really disheartening to know that I already see what they were doing and what they did. And in the process, they successfully did it. And he ended up with nothing, you know. Members of the group, resentful of being pushed further and further into the background, rebel. There were constant arguments over the wording of the newspaper advertisements and theater billings. On several occasions, the tour was nearly sabotaged by fistfights and threats of a sit-down strike by Frankie's disgruntled fellow singers. By spring of 1957, dissension between Frankie and the members of this group had reached a crisis stage, and manager Morris Levy, decided something had to be done. His decision was to allow Frankie to split with the group and go out on his own as a single. At that time, it was felt that we could make twice as much money with two separate and independent acts as we could with one, Frankie disclosed. Now, this is what they're telling him. You're still part of the group. You do your thing. You could do your separate thing. And then you could come back with the group. This is extra money in your pockets. This is what they try to sell them. You know, knowing that they're eventually trying to just phase the other people out. At first, it seemed that the idea would really work. I cut Ella Fitzgerald's old song Goody Goody on my own without the group, and it sold 1 million copies. Money was rolling in for a while, but then things began to go wrong. We found that many club and theater owners weren't as willing to pay top dollar for only one part of the original group. See, this is what happens. People want a group. If people are going to go see SWV, they want to see SWV, not just Coco. Unless she's like 90 years old and the other Golden Girls are not around her. Then they'll say, okay, we'll accept Coco and whatever you have. Because they already know what happened. So they're conditioned to saying, okay, I'll accept it as for what it is. But if it's not like that, and they're around and they're just not in a group, oh, no. People are not going to really support that artist. So I thought I'd just give it clear to a more updated time frame so you can get the understanding of what Frankie and the teenagers were doing back then, what was being done to them. And this was all about greed at the end of the day, because they didn't want to split the money up with 5 people. They wanted to kind of keep that money narrowed down. They figured, okay, we'll keep it on Frankie. Therefore, they can have these contracts that will be able to take advantage of him in the long run and rip him off even more. Millions of dollars was a lot of money today. Imagine it was back in the 50s, 1955, 1956, 57. He made a total of about $2.5 million from just 2 singles, even though they had other songs in between that, but just overall the popularity. So it just goes to show you, where did all that money go? What happened? Slowly dwindling prestige of both acts fell even more when the teenagers followed in Frankie's footsteps cut a record on their own without him. The tune entitled Flip Flop was appropriately named, Frankie declares wildly. It was one of the biggest flops waxed by the company that year, and to make matters worse, people associated the record with me, although I wasn't on it. Now see, he was a writer too, so he took offense to it because it flopped. And he's like, no, this is not me. And he also probably was in his feelings too, because I don't think they ever got closure on the situation as far as when they broke up. You know, it was kind of a little dissension here and there, and just like you see on Unsung and you see on these different shows and groups trying to get back together, like Escape, and even the Braxton sisters can't even get along together to do one cohesive album. You know, they got all this residual triggers and traumas that happen, and they're in their feelings, so it's hard to get together on one accord. And this was what was happening here. And these were kids now, so you can imagine. Frankie's problem with narcotics began late 1958, about the same time that his career took a nosedive. I'm kind of a guy who either has it all good or all bad, he laments. When things start going bad for me, the roof really cave in. Today, sitting in a sparsely furnished 4th-floor Harlem walk-up apartment where his family has lived for the past 25 years, Frankie reflects upon the past and the plots out strategy for his return to the top. He realized better than anyone the odds are double stacked against him. It was unwritten showbiz law that child stars just don't make it second time around. But Frankie has several factors in his favor which may help him beat the child star jinx. As an experienced showbiz veteran, he knows most of the pitfalls which could trap him an unseasoned novice, and he vows that this time he will avoid them. He has an honest and efficient personal manager, retired dancer Sam Bray, who literally pulled Frankie out of the Harlem gutter in early 1966, cleaned him up, and persuaded him to take the cure. When Frankie came out of the hospital, he signed a contract with Bray. Now, Bray was his new management at this time. He decided to take him on after he was considered like a has-been. And as you saw in that movie, this was probably about the time when he was really going through the heroin crisis, and he was in between the different wives, and his voice was changing, and he was getting older, and he wasn't the really cute little kid anymore. He was just older looking guy, and a lot of that played a toll probably too with his addiction as well. So considering all of this, you know, he was given the opportunity because people believed in his talent. If you go into YouTube and look at different clips and watch their performances, he had a really good voice as a kid. And of course, when you get older, it changes. But he was very talented. Like, this was his God-given gift. And it's too bad that it was just, he was just washed up. You know, they washed him up. Bray, who earned a modest income of $200 a week as an inspector for a food product company in the Bronx, admit that his biggest obstacle facing Frankie in his comeback attempt is financial. A star needs many things. He needs a repertoire of good arrangements, a flashy wardrobe, vocal coaching, things that cost big money. All that Frankie has going from him now is talent and guts. Other than a few frayed Roger Pete suits, which are now too small for him to wear, Frankie has little to show for his teenage heydays and when his group earned more than $500,000 in a single year. Woo. Adding to Frankie's comeback problems, the fact that some people don't believe his dope cure will last. Promoters, nightclub, and theater owners aware that few addicts succeed permanently, shaking the monkey off their backs, are openly reluctant to book an entertainer whose craving may cause him to miss performances. Frankie himself admits that this is not the first time he tried to lick the narcotic habit. He made a short-lived attempt to shake the monkey in 1960, about a year after he had become addicted. Now, heroin is tough, as you can see, and he did try to kick the habit. Okay, I'm going to go more into this. He had learned to use a hypodermic needle during a New York party where a lot of musicians were shooting the stuff. Wow. A woman at the same party showed him to skin pop, to prick the skin with the needle to get a mild kick. Oh my gosh. I never intended to get hooked on dope, he recalls. I knew it was bad, and at first I was content to just skin pop. But soon I got daring, and it wasn't long before I was injecting the stuff right into my veins. This part is sad. Because at this point, he put a gun to his head at this point. This was his life ruined. At these parties, people doing drugs, this lady introduced him. So it was a woman who taught him how to shoot up. Can you imagine that? And probably a much older woman. He was a kid. This is crazy. Bob Rendercross, a veteran showbiz performer who was Frankie's road manager for a while, took the young singer under his protective wing. Bob talked to me like a father, Frankie revealed. He tried to make me realize that dope could ruin my life. He told me about other entertainers whose lives have been cut short by addiction, people he knew personally, like Charles Yarborough Parker, which we know as Charlie Parker. He made me move into his house on Long Island where he could be around me all the time, make sure I wasn't sneaking drugs. Frankie was making good progress in conquering his addiction when personal tragedy plunged into deep depression. His 39-year-old mother, ill for more than a year with terminal cancer, died, unaware until the end that she had the disease. We never told her the truth, Frankie revealed. She believed she was going to get well. I used to go to the hospital and tell her to hurry up and get well so she could come with me on my next overseas tour. One of the last things she asked me before she died is if I had overcome my habit. So his mom knew he was an addict. That's sad. I told her, Mom, don't worry. I'm doing the best that I can. Bob's taking good care of me. 4 months later, she died. Despondent over his mother's death, the 18-year-old entertainer turned to narcotics to deaden his grief. 5 long years passed before he met Sam Bray in early 1966 and made his second attempt to overcome his addiction. At 24, Frankie is far more mature and self-assured than he was at 18, and this fact alone may enable him to sustain his cure. I know that many people aren't convinced that I have kicked the habit for good, he declares, but I know it, and that's the main thing. Sooner or later, the skeptics will get around to believe in me. Meanwhile, I'm content to wait. And that was the end of the article. It shows a picture of him walking with his manager in the park in New York, and they're just talking, and it's like he's giving him some advice. And he's intently listening, eagerly listening. He had all good intentions of trying to get himself back together. But at the time, like, the odds were just stacked up against him. Heroin is a horrible drug, like any other drug, but this the worst. And killed a lot of entertainers, and he was one of them. So as much as attention he had trying to kick the habit, it was always that chance that he may not. And this article is really sad because it was like right up to almost a year later, he died. He died in February 1968. This article came out in January 1967. I also wanted to read letters to the editor. It was this article in March 1967 of Ebony. Actually, on the cover is Dr. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. But in the article, there were people who read this and it was just like, wishing him the best. And, by this time they knew, what was the conditions of what was going on with him. And this is what he wrote. Coincidental with the publication of the article concerning me in the last issue of Ebony Magazine, come back up at X-Star, I have joined the United States Army. My health is improved to the extent where I can participate in maneuvers, exercises, and 1-mile runs every morning before breakfast. I am presently in the infantry and hope that it will be possible for me to serve in special services so that I can resume my activities as an entertainer. Special services in the military is kind of like they have the band, the military band. They actually have people in the service that just their main job is just to travel and perform in the military band. They travel and go to USOs and different shows and just sing or play an instrument. It's a great career for those who want to be in the music business and want a steady guaranteed check and travel and serve their country at the same time. I know I sound like a recruiter here, but I just had to put that in there. That's what he was talking about. I felt that the experiences of the past and those described in the article have given me a greater insight into the misery, the loneliness, the frustration, and the personal tragedies which can affect individuals. I think this realization has had added depth to my capacities as an artist. I sincerely hope that other artists will recognize their responsibility as I now recognize my responsibility to the welfare of our people. I sincerely hope that every performer will voluntarily and in fact eagerly assume an active share in all movements benefiting our people and establishing their rights to live as individuals, as families, and as members of a great democracy. Private Frank J. Lyman, Fort Gordon, Georgia. That was a letter he wrote to the editor regarding his article and interview. And the other part that they didn't mention, which was the tragedy, is I read somewhere else that his second wife at the time, she had a baby. After the baby was born, the baby died, I think like 2 days later in the hospital or something like that, and that was sad. And he dealt with a lot between his mother passing away and then losing his daughter at infancy, dealing with the breakup of his group, um, just being used up, basically. People took advantage of him. They took advantage of his youth. And it seems like the more you think things will have changed, a lot hasn't. There's still people being ripped off in the contracts. There's still people using drugs. You know, as recent as, Mac Miller, who passed away from drug overdose. There are things that have not changed in this entertainment industry. And they don't prep these kids when they're young to know their value and their worth, that when they carry that with them into adulthood, they can do other things in this world. They can contribute in other means and measures. He started seeing his potential when he joined the Army. And initially it looked like it wasn't intentional. He had to do it because he was sentenced to do it. But then that's where he met his third wife. And then I heard that he even went AWOL, so he got kicked out. He got a dishonorable discharge. They weren't playing back then. But he got that because he was going around to the different small clubs out there and performing, because people recognized who he was and they wanted him to perform. So he ended up messing up in the Army. But that wasn't really his passion initially anyway. His passion has always been music. That was a gift, and that was what he was comfortable and used to doing. And that's what he wanted to do. And he ended up, they said back in February of '68, he went back to New York for this, supposed to be like this debut he's supposed to be doing the next day, I think, recording a song. He had already recorded 2 songs, but he's supposed to record another song. And his grandma at the time was not home. She was away visiting a family member. And he, I guess, maybe went to a party, or he was with his uncle, they said. And this is where it gets a little sketchy. And they said that he got caught up got high again. And he OD'd. Now, from what I saw, they said he was clean for 3 years because of, him dealing with his manager, Sam Bray, then having to go through the Army. If your body was clean for 3 years and then he relapsed onto something that he thinks is mild or meek, formula of heroin to inject, when it's actually very potent at this point because his body's been clean, it killed him. It killed him right on the spot. Now, some people say that it wasn't necessarily him ODing, like maybe he was murdered. Who knows at this point? But from reading this article and seeing the repetitive pattern of this relapse and knowing the conditions he was brought against, it looks more likely he relapsed, And drugs didn't end well for Billie Holiday. It didn't end well for Charlie Parker. There was another singer named Esther Phillips who started when she was 13, got hooked on drugs, heroin. But she grew up her whole life into adulthood. And she actually died as an older woman, but she has so many health problems from that. I go on to say, because I'm going to go ahead and cut this now because it's getting a little long, but I just wanted to share his story because we always hear about from the movie, and the movie is written from a perspective of writers in Hollywood, and they don't always give the thorough story behind the scenes. So it was great to see this article, read the interview from his own words, and even read the response from the letter of the editor to see where he was at and where his head was at the time. Like I said, he did get his rewards after he passed. You know, he got in 1993, they got inducted, him and the teenagers got inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was presented by boys singing group Boys to Men. They also got a Hollywood Walk of Fame. Two remaining members, I'm not sure if they're still alive. I think one might recently passed. They were performing as a teenager, so they were still going around like the oldies and goodies circuit performing. And even Frankie Lymon's younger brother, as you saw in this video, he was even, before he passed in 2013, I believe, he was doing some performances with them as well. So there you have it. That is the story of Frankie Lymon, I call it the Lonely Architect. He paved the way. He started the trend with the kids groups. He a lot of times is lonely paving that road to success, and the others who follow behind you eventually see what you sacrifice to get there and where you were at. Not always recognized in the beginning, but always appreciated at the end. A lot of times when it's too late. I am Roz, aka of Receipt City. Hope you all having a wonderful day, evening, and night. And thank you for joining me today. Feel free to leave a comment, like, share, subscribe as well. You know the usual plug. Take care. Till the next time.